At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Corporal James, Jimmy, Dalton crouched in a muddy ditch outside Cassino, Italy, watching a German armored scout car roll toward his position at about 15 miles per hour. He had no anti-tank weapons, no mines, no grenades, only a length of rusted barbed wire wrapped around a shovel handle, an improvised device that every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly forbidden him from using. In the next 90 seconds, that wire would overturn doctrine and save an entire company from destruction. The U.S. Army Field Manual listed 16 approved methods for disabling light armor, and Dalton's wasn't one of them. Battalion Command had already threatened him twice with court-martial for unauthorized field modifications, but regulations don't mean much when you've watched 11 men die in 3 weeks because the approved methods require equipment nobody has. Dalton pulled the wire taut as the morning fog clung to the Leary Valley like wet cotton. He could hear the German SD, KFZ, 222's engine grinding forward, the commander's hatch open, the crew likely scanning for American positions. The wire trembled in his hands. One chance. Jimmy Dalton grew up in Gary, Indiana, the son of a U.S. steelworker who labored 15-hour shifts in blast furnaces to feed 6 children. Jimmy spent his afternoons in rail yards instead of classrooms, learning how systems failed and how small fixes with wire and scrap metal could prevent disasters. By 17 he was a switchman, trained to see how one broken connection could derail everything. He enlisted in January 1943, 3 months after turning 19, promised training and opportunity but delivered 8 weeks of basic instruction, an unfamiliar rifle, and transport to North Africa. By the time he reached Italy later that year, he understood the reality of war. The 34th Infantry Division fought north through Italy village by village, ridge by ridge, but what killed more Americans than assaults was German reconnaissance. Light armored scout cars appeared at dawn and dusk, mapping positions and calling in artillery. The SD, KFZ, 222 was fast, lightly armored, armed with a 20mm cannon and machine gun, able to strike and disappear before Americans could respond. Doctrine said to stop them with bazookas, mines, or anti-tank rifles, but the division barely had any. So men died. Eddie Kowalski was killed on February 18 when rifle rounds bounced off a scout car's armor and the machine gun answered. Sergeant Mike Brennan died 5 days later trying to stop one with a grenade. Corporal Luis Vargas died on March 4, cut down while running for cover. By early March, 47 men had been lost to reconnaissance vehicles alone. After another attack killed 2 more soldiers on March 10, Dalton made his decision. That night he took barbed wire and 2 entrenching tools and went out alone. He chose a narrow road between 2 trees, placed the shovels deep in the mud, and strung the wire 14 inches off the ground, exactly axle height. Too loose and it would snap, too tight and it would break. He adjusted it until it hummed, buried it lightly, and returned to his foxhole. At dawn, the scout car came through the fog. At 50 yards, the wire caught the front axle, locking the wheel instantly. Momentum flipped the vehicle violently, rolling it 3 times before it landed upside down. Dalton ran forward as the engine screamed, capturing the surviving crew and removing the wire before officers arrived. Officially, the car had simply flipped. Unofficially, the solution spread. Quietly, at night, soldiers copied the setup. More scout cars flipped or crashed. German patrols slowed, dismounted, and grew cautious. Artillery strikes dropped. Casualties stopped. Officers noticed the results but couldn't approve the method without admitting doctrine had failed. Dalton was eventually reassigned to quietly teach the technique to other units, never officially documented, never credited by name. After the war, he returned to Gary, married, raised a family, and worked in the rail yards for 4 decades. He never talked about Italy, never sought recognition. Years later, military doctrine adopted wire obstacles at axle height, credited vaguely to field experience in Italy. The method survived. The man faded into history. That's how innovation really happens in war, not through manuals or committees, but through soldiers who can't watch their friends die anymore and are willing to risk punishment to stop it. Punishing Dalton would have been easy, but command saw something else. They saw fewer scout cars, fewer artillery strikes, and men who had been dying now staying alive. Battalion rejected the report, division looked the other way, and no one officially approved the method, but no one ordered it stopped either. That was the compromise. On paper, everything followed the manual. On the ground, the wire stayed in place. Dalton was never court-martialed. He was given silence instead. And in that silence, the method spread. No orders, no medals, no credit. In war, sometimes the system doesn't change. It simply steps aside when something better works. And that morning in the Italian mud, a corporal's wire said everything that needed to be said. Punishing Dalton would have been easy, but command saw something else. They saw fewer scout cars, fewer artillery strikes, and men who had been dying now staying alive. Battalion rejected the report, division looked the other way, and no one officially approved the method, but no one ordered it stopped either. That was the compromise. On paper, everything followed the manual. On the ground, the wire stayed in place. Dalton was never court-martialed. He was given silence instead. And in that silence, the method spread. No orders, no medals, no credit. In war, sometimes the system doesn't change. It simply steps aside when something better works. And that morning in the Italian mud, a corporal's wire said everything that needed to be said.